Okay, so hello and welcome to my talk today. My name is Beth Radulski. I am a PhD candidate at Trobe University and the Olga Tennyson Autism Research Center and the Department of Social Inquiry as well, because I'm doing a multidisciplinary PhD thesis. And I'm currently working as the project officer for neurodiversity at Trobe. So I thought I would speak to you a little bit today about both the work that I do in my PhD and in my role as project officer, but also I'd like to go through this talk sort of through a framework of lived experience to some extent as well. I'm autistic myself, and obviously doing a PhD now, I have spent quite a few years in university. So I can speak a little bit to the lived experience of being an undergraduate student who did not disclose my autism status. I'm going to talk a bit about why I didn't, what the barriers to disclosure were, and why and how and when I did ultimately come out to do a PhD on the sociology of autistic social inequality. So hopefully this talk can contribute something meaningful to the wonderful conference that's been organized, and I will go ahead and get started. So before I begin, I just want to give a little bit of a content warning that I might discuss some difficult themes throughout. Because I'm talking about social inequality, I'm going to try to sort of situate autistic social inequality in a broader sociological context. So I'm going to be speaking about marginality and oppression as they affect autistic people. Because I work with intersectional theory as well, I might also be engaging with these topics as they relate to other minority populations. And of course, there are autistic people who are members of all of these minority populations. So I did just want to give a content warning that there might be some difficult material canvassed, particularly in the first half of this talk. So when I started my PhD, I really was influenced very heavily by the neurodiversity movement and its goal of sort of highlighting some of the potential limitations of over-relying on a medical model of disability. So when I sort of tried to, figure out and conceptualize what is neurodiversity in a social sciences context, this is the imagery that my brain sort of produced for me. So here you have my medical model of disability or neurodiversity, I guess you'd call it. And it's very clear, there's a healthy neurotypical brain. It functions correctly, and other brains that aren't classified as neurotypical, we consider to be disordered. And in an ideal context, in the medical model, we'd think, well, if a brain is disordered and we'd like for that person to be able to function effectively in society and achieve, socioeconomic participation and political inclusion, then ideally that person should aim to get as close as possible to the neurotypical norm so that they can function in a healthy way. So as a sociologist, when I started thinking through this idea, I started thinking about all the times in history where we've had a similar ideal of like one standard of normal. So that could be for race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, and how oftentimes the majority group in a given population is going to form the normative ideal for what the ideal citizen in that population should look like, act like, behave like. So the idea that minorities in that population, again, be they gender, sexual, religious, cultural, racial, or otherwise, should ideally aim to assimilate with that norm. As a sociologist, I kind of found that a bit problematic because historically, we can see that that doesn't always provide equity in a society when a minority group is expected to function in line with the norm in order to achieve inclusion and participation. So I started thinking, if we bring the social sciences approach and understanding to neurodiversity, how can we highlight the limitations of this approach and maybe suggest some alternatives? So again, this is when the content might get a little bit tricky. I thought, because my project is semi-autoethnographic, I'm going to be reflecting on my lived experiences. So I am 30 years old right now. So I grew up in an era where we knew much less about autism and certainly less about neurodiversity than we do now. I should also specify I wasn't identified and ultimately diagnosed as autistic until I was in my mid-20s. So as a child and a teenager and young woman, I didn't identify as autistic, but certainly I grew up with the idea that being autistic wasn't necessarily a positive thing. There were a lot of talks about, rising diagnostic rates and an epidemic and needing to protect people from this condition that at the time was thought to be, a burden to society and was thought to be quite a negative thing to experience firsthand. So I grew up with this discourse that we should ideally, again, we should try to make sure that autistic people don't have to be autistic necessarily, and they should be assimilated with the normative standard if they want to function effectively in society, and indeed if they want to live meaningful lives at all. And as a sociologist, again, when I look at some of these trends, I start thinking, well, this isn't unique to autism discourse. We have spoken about minority populations this way in deeply intersectional ways throughout history, and the way that we conceptualize what is normal and what is healthy and what a meaningful life is really deeply intertwined with normative standards in society that tend to see difference as a negative thing a lot of the time. We usually need to take voices from within those communities to change that view. And we can think about that when we think about the civil rights movement, women's rights movements, Aboriginal and Indigenous and First Nations rights movements, and gay rights movements. We all needed to listen to people from within those communities who were able to challenge that dominant narrative and say, actually, these lives are worthy, they are important, and I don't necessarily need to fall in line with a normative standard in order to be valuable and happy and live a fulfilling life. The other important thing I think that we learn from a lot of those movements is that oftentimes the perception that these populations aren't capable of inclusion isn't necessarily lying in a biological cause. There are a lot of social and political barriers to inclusion for these populations. So I don't want to conflate my experiences. I am a privileged middle-class white woman. I don't want to conflate my experiences with those of other minority groups that I'm not a part of. But I do think it's important to recognize the broader patterns of oppression at play. And I think it's also really important to acknowledge that autistic people come from all of those minority groups as well. So when we think about, why wouldn't an autistic student disclose their autism status? We have to think about this intersectionally. We have to understand the sociological and cultural factors that are at play in making that person feel unsafe to be openly autistic. So I take a particular interest in this issue of disclosure. I'm really fascinated with the topic of autistic masking. And that is the main area of autism research that I'm exploring in my PhD. So autistic masking broadly is the purposeful concealment of autistic traits in an effort to pass as normal or non-autistic or neurotypical. So we've thought about this in the psychology literature as, concealing, camouflaging, evading diagnosis, and something that girls and women might do that would prevent a clinician from recognizing autistic traits. Again, sociologically, I'm really interested in what it is to mask in a cultural context, because as a late diagnosed autistic woman, I masked very, very successfully for much of my life. I still do mask at times. I'm probably masking to some degree right now because I know that if I want you to find me engaging, I need to do certain things with my face and with my voice that would fall within the lines of neurotypical communication norms. But I also started unmasking in my PhD because I started thinking, well, and granted, you know, I'm in a relatively privileged context at a university with people who are very accepting, and I'm in a very collegial department. But I was able to sort of think about, again, that sociological idea of why should I have to mask and pass as neurotypical to achieve inclusion in my educational setting and in my workplace. So when I started my PhD, I wanted to address the question, you know, what are the social drivers of masking? Why do autistic people feel unsafe being visibly or overtly autistic in public? And I thought it would be really important to contextualize some of the consequences of unmasking as documented in the psychology literature. So 7% of autistic people report feeling accepted by society, meaning that, you know, 93% don't feel accepted as an autistic person. The most common reasons that autistic people give for masking include passing in a neurotypical world and avoiding retaliation and bullying. In addition, autistic people report masking to obtain jobs and qualifications that they feel are less accessible to them if they're visibly autistic. And autistic people choose to stay in the closet in professional environments because they feel that they're likely to be excluded if they do come out as autistic. So there are social drivers of masking evidenced throughout these studies because they basically reflect autistic people saying, I don't feel safe being autistic. If people know that I'm autistic, I won't be given the same treatment. I won't be given the same opportunities as my neurotypical peers. And so if I pass as neurotypical, I can obtain a level of social inclusion that I can't obtain when I'm visibly autistic. So it's not that the person is inherently incapable of participating. It's that society is putting barriers in the way of participation for many autistic people. So in a tertiary context, again, I think it's really important to question why university students disclose autism at relatively low rates. So these were some of the questions that I grappled with when I thought about coming out or staying in the closet. I worried about my reputation. I knew that I wanted to do postgraduate studies. I was very afraid that I wouldn't be able to find a supervisor. I worried that somehow if my lecturers knew that I was autistic, a level of unconscious bias might come in, that I wouldn't get grades as good as my peers because they might not think an autistic person is capable of achieving the same level of success. I worried about my career after graduation, and I suspect in some fields especially, I worked as a childcare worker throughout my degree, and I was very afraid that if I came out publicly, I might not be able to work in childcare anymore because people wouldn't trust that I was capable of caring for their children. So there's a lot of pressure to maintain that mask, not just because you want to pass as neurotypical in a social setting, but because in my case, and in the case of many of the research participants that I referenced in the previous slide, you know, there are broader social, economic, political consequences of being openly autistic. Now, I live in Australia right now, but I'm Canadian by birth, and I was very lucky in that we got permanent residency before I received an autism diagnosis. But certainly, even since then, I've often worried, you know, I'm very publicly out as autistic now. Is there any chance that someone could try to say that, you know, I shouldn't have received my visa? And could that impact my citizenship? Could that impact my family? What would happen if I weren't allowed to stay here because I'm autistic? And there's a perception that I might be a burden on the taxpayer or incapable of, you know, political, social, economic participation. So when we speak about, you know, getting autistic people to disclose their autism status and to unmask, we have to ask ourselves, do the benefits of disclosure outweigh the risks? We have to have a sort of sociologically informed understanding of what the risks of disclosure are. So when I was hired to work as the project officer for neurodiversity at Trobe, I came into this with a fairly non-traditional approach. You know, as I've said, traditionally the approach is to sort of assimilate anyone outside the norm as close to the norm as possible in the hopes that they'll function more effectively. And in, you know, in disability rights context, we might say we can provide reasonable adjustments, but there's not much in the way of changing culture. It tends to be a very individualistic approach. So as a sociologist, I really wanted to change that and mix it up and say, well, what could we achieve at La Trobe if we don't view neurodiversity and autism status as an individual thing? If we don't look at the individual and say, how can we fix that individual or fix things for that individual by way of reasonable adjustments? Like, what if we looked at this as how can we change our institution, our culture, our policy, our professional development to make sure that our university is actually a safe place for autistic people and for neurodiverse student cohorts more broadly? So in the beginning of the presentation, I showed you the traditional medical model, and this is my conceptualization of the social model. This is the model that I'm proposing and working with in my PhD. I would argue that we need to conceptualize neurodiversity in a similar way that we would conceptualize cultural diversity. So rather than thinking, you know, should we aim to assimilate minority groups in with the majority, how can we actually change society to make it more equitable for minority groups? How can we recognize the privilege that the majority has, in this case, the neurotypical majority, and how can we recognize the marginality that affects people with minority neurotypes like autism or ADHD, for example? So the aim here is really to achieve social equity. We're approaching this in a number of ways, and I'm going to break down each of these in their own slides, so I won't read them out here, but I just wanted to give you the broader picture before we get going. And begin by saying that, again, it's really about cultural change in this case. So first, I think it's important to touch on the idea of inclusion and representation. Our neurodiversity project is led by an autistic person. I'm the first openly autistic autism researcher at La Trobe, and I first came out in March of 2019 with a blog post on, you know, what my PhD was about and why I thought it was important to come out as autistic. And since then, we've had quite a number. I'm very pleased and thrilled to say there are now quite a number of openly autistic autism researchers and even academics. So I'm thrilled to see that there is meaningful change happening. People are starting to feel like if someone else has done it, I can do it too. And I think this is really important because when we think about other social issues like gay rights on campus or gender equality on campus, if we see that one person has taken the initiative and achieved inclusion in that space, I think it's a lot more likely that other people will follow and see, well, perhaps this is a safe enough space for me to do that. So this was at the Olga Tennyson Center strategic plan launch last year. And I was really thrilled because that was one of the first events where I was actually publicly identified as autistic and introduced to people as autistic. And so that was a big milestone for me. And I'm very grateful to my one of my PhD supervisors, Cheryl DeSanyaka, who's at my side in this photo, because she was really the one that facilitated that and supported me throughout that process. So the next thing that's important to talk about is cultural sensitivity and changing the narrative. So again, we start with this medical model of deficit and asking students to disclose on the basis of deficit. And of course, I'm not trying to erase any of the validity in the medical model or claim that autistic people don't experience any difficulties whatsoever. But I do think that we need to ensure that there is also a strengths-based approach. I think we do need to provide an opportunity for autistic staff and students to also identify themselves as having strengths, the same way that an average person in society isn't asked to define themselves by their deficits. They're asked, who are you? What are you good at? I think we need to change that narrative in a neurodiversity context. So we've produced a neurodiversity toolkit. We have a cultural sensitivity guide, a DIY sensory room guide. We have language guides on how to engage with and speak to autistic people in a culturally sensitive and respectful way. Working with equity and diversity, we are reviewing our policy and ensuring that we're able to provide tailored support to autistic students. So one of the things that we have done is professional development seminars that I've delivered to our equity and diversity teams and our peer learning advisors, who are students hired to help other students with their learning on campus. We're training academic staff as well. So what is it to be autistic? What is it to not be neurotypical? How can you engage with these students in a productive manner? In teaching and learning, we've started providing ally training for academics in some of our departments. So I've been going and giving presentations to departments, again, talking about some of the strengths that they can potentially expect to see in autistic students. How can you use some of those traits to promote and enrich their learning experiences in ways that are, not as strictly governed by neurotypical norms? And I think these seminars have been really productive in starting discussions that just weren't happening before. And I've even actually had a colleague who, I think I can mention the name here because he's now publicly come out as autistic on radio, attended one of my seminars and realized in the seminar that he might actually be autistic, and has since gotten a diagnosis and come out publicly on radio, Ben Habib. So I would really recommend, if you find that interview, he gives a bit more detail into what the training session was like and how it changed his views on what autism and neurodiversity are. And this is just another example of some of the tools we give to staff members to help them use study tools that are tailored to the needs of autistic learners. So I like breaking things down into small steps as a good example to offset the feeling of being overwhelmed or struggling with executive dysfunction. These are some of the things that I was able to find help, or I found that they really helped me as a student. And campus and accessibility is obviously another key point. So part of our neurodiversity toolkit involves accessible event checklists. So we have these for classrooms and lecture theater events, campus tours, online events, and Zoom seminars now, which was a post-COVID edition, obviously. And the other one's slipping my mind right now, but these are all available. And I'll put up a link at the end of the presentation to the website where you can find these materials. And finally, of course, another really important aspect of taking a cultural approach is acceptance and celebration. I've touched already on the strength-based approaches. So I'll focus more on public outreach. Again, we've made sure that this project is publicized. My identity as an open autistic person is publicized. And we've been focusing on creating resources that allow neurodiverse cohorts and also neurotypical cohorts to begin to understand neurodiversity better and start thinking about some of the positive contributions that this form of diversity can contribute to society more broadly. So I'm just trying to wrap up quickly here, but I just wanted to sort of give one final comparison. So again, my approach is very sociological and cultural. Instead of changing the individual, how can we change society to be more equitable for the individual? That's really at the crux of what I'm getting at. And I think following from that, unmasking and disclosure and equity are going to be much more accessible. So as promised, here's the final link to follow up with neurodiversityhub.org. I'm sure many of you know Andrew Eddy and his wonderful work with Untapped and Neurodiversity Hub. And there are so many resources available there that are built by and for autistic people, dyslexic people, ADHD people. And it's a really wonderful place that sort of centralizes a lot of resources for any institution or person that wants to know more about a paradigm shift towards neurodiversity. So I'm just coming up to my time limit, I think, so I'm going to wrap it up there. But thank you so much all for listening and taking the time. And I really hope that I've been able to contribute something and provide a learning opportunity today. So I'm looking forward to seeing everyone else speak, and thank you so much for coming along.